At the press conference today, we have three distinguished speakers. The first is Ms. Reaghan Tarbell. She's a Mohawk documentary filmmaker from Canada. Her film, To Brooklyn and Back, A Mohawk Journey, will be screened tonight. It won the Best Feature Documentary at the 2008 Winnipeg Aboriginal Film Festival. In the middle, we have Professor Américo Mendoza-Mori. He's a Peruvian faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, where he started the Quechua language program. And on the far end, Ms. Chandra-Roy Henriksen, the chief of the Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in the Division for Social Policy and Development at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So let's start with you, Chandra.
The UN started looking into Indigenous people's rights many, many years ago. And one of the main reasons why they looked into it initially was in the 1950s, when they looked at the incidents of Indigenous peoples who were very much involved in terms of employment. And this was, in fact, the ILO, one of the first UN agencies that started looking into this issue. Building on that work, the ILO has two conventions. One is Convention 107, and then we have Convention 169. And these kind of laid the framework for the work that was then initiated to have a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which would affect the whole UN system and be relevant globally on the global agenda. It took, as Martina says, it took 25 years for the declaration to be drafted, discussed, negotiated, and adopted. One of the main reasons being that Indigenous peoples, wherever they may live, whether it's in developing countries or in developed countries, whether it's in Latin America, Asia, Africa, United States, or in the Scandinavian countries, Indigenous peoples are sensitive issues. And this comes to the reason for why the declaration took so long in being adopted, because one of the main discussion points between the member states and Indigenous peoples, of course the UN system was also there to provide support, was in terms of the right to self-determination. Indigenous peoples were very strong in saying that this was a major right, a basic right, and was fundamental to any other rights that were ongoing in the UN continuing its work. The declaration is also a major milestone. It was the first time where you had Indigenous peoples and member states working very, very, very closely hand in hand. These 25 years that it took for the declaration to be adopted was when you had Indigenous peoples working side by side with member states. And this happened at the first working group on Indigenous populations, then at the Commission on Human Rights, as it was called then, and continued on in the General Assembly. On the 13th of September 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was a major breakthrough because therein, in the declaration, and I'm sure many of you, most of you have actually, I hope, read through it or looked through parts of it, it includes very, very important elements for Indigenous people's rights: the rights to lands, resources, and territories, environment, the right of free, prior, informed consent in terms of development that is taking place in their lands and territories, and of course also important elements in terms of how to operationalize the UN Declaration in terms of education, health, basic services, employment, and these are just some of the issues that are touched on. It has major implications for the UN system because this was the first time there was global consensus. And it was very good that in 2010, there were 4 countries that had voted against the declaration being adopted, and they since reversed their positions and now endorse and support fully the declaration. And these were major countries, for instance, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And now you have what is global consensus on the declaration. We're very pleased that, in fact, it is Bolivia that has taken the first major step in making the declaration part of its national legislation. And we're hoping that there will be other countries that will also follow this principle, this practice. In 2014, the UN had a first World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. And as a result of that, the member states reiterated their commitment to the UN Declaration. Another major outcome of the World Conference is that the member states asked the UN system to come up with a system-wide action plan, because many of the UN system agencies, programs, funds were working with indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, in different regions, in different parts of what their mandated areas were for health, education, or for children, or women's rights. And we now have a system-wide action plan which was developed under the guidance of the Under-Secretary General of DESA, under the leadership of the Secretary General, and are now being endorsed by the Chief Executive's Board, and we are now working on implementing the system-wide action plan. And that is where we're at the moment. There are also efforts at the national level to develop national action plans on indigenous peoples, and this is where the UN is also providing its support. I also want to mention that the UN member states have decided that 2017, which is the 10-year anniversary of the declaration, is going to be a major event to mark this commemoration. So we are encouraging our partners, indigenous peoples, member states, and UN agencies to make this a one-year anniversary that is not just one event, but is marked with a series of events throughout the year.
Ms. Tarbell?
I am the executive director of the Kanien'kehá:ka Ung'waunara'ti Txoko Language and Cultural Center in Kahnawake, and that is just a brief example of what I do know how to say in my own language. I greeted you and introduced myself. I just want to touch on that very briefly. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank the UN for the invitation to screen my film, To Brooklyn and Back, A Mohawk Journey. I made the film in 2007. It was quite a journey in itself. I moved to New York in 2002, and it was a journey that had my ancestors and my grandparents and my parents had taken years before. Not many people know, but there was a large Mohawk community located in downtown Brooklyn, roughly from the 1920s to the 1960s. This was during the construction boom of New York. There were many families that came. The men were working on high steel, and the women were raising the children and ensuring that they knew who they were and their identity and their language to some extent. These are themes that I explored in my film, and I wanted to make this film because my experiences moving to New York were so different from how I imagined my family's experiences before me. When I moved to New York, there was no community like there was before. There was men working here, sure, but not to the extent that my parents and my family experienced New York. And just to touch on the fact, traveling here today from Brooklyn with my little son, it gives me, taking the train and the subway and going up the stairs and down the stairs, just gives me a little bit more appreciation as to what they went through during that time. It's not easy. So, but I did want to focus more on the fact that the women, I wanted to make this film because the women played such an important role in the community. Back then, today, on the reserve and in the cities as well. When the men moved here, the women came with them. And in some cases, like my late grandmother, she came by herself because she had to support her family. She worked as a maid. She took in sewing. She did what she could. And when she met my grandfather, he was working here in New York as well. They decided to raise their children here. And every summer they would go back to the reserve so their children would know where they came from and the importance of that. I'm not sure if I'm going over time. So these are themes that I explore in my film in more detail, and things that I'll talk about tonight during the screening. But just suffice it to say, what I felt was that the men's story, the iron workers, the high steel workers, their story has been told many times, and it's a very important story. I felt the woman's story had not really been told before, and that's why I decided to focus on this in my documentary. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mendoza-Mori?
Good morning, everyone. I work at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm in charge of the Quechua language program. Quechua is the most spoken indigenous language in the Americas. It has about 6 to 8 million speakers, mostly in the Andes, in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and some areas of Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. Few universities offer this language in comparison to other world languages. So having the opportunity to be at the university and see it as a platform to recognize the value of indigenous languages such as Quechua is an incredible opportunity. Because at the program we believe that language is not only a communication tool. Language represents knowledge and culture. And by recognizing culture, knowledge, and language, we are respecting the speakers, the indigenous peoples, as citizens. Universities have also had a long tradition of assimilation with indigenous peoples. So working on that in a university will help us to reflect on how in this post-colonial context it is still necessary to raise awareness on these issues and the value of the languages and to promote a more diverse education system. By recognizing the knowledge of the indigenous peoples as such, not as only myths or stories, we can respect the people. And just to put examples on that, in these times when we talk about climate change, the respect of the indigenous people, specifically in the Andes, about the Mother Earth, called as Pachamama, is an example that these issues are part of indigenous knowledge. And that's why it's important to have this in these platforms. The same as the United Nations, who in 2015 approved a proposal by Bolivia that recognized 3 proverbs of the Andes, of Andean knowledge. And 3 proverbs in Quechua are Amasua, Amalulia, Amagelia, which means do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. These proposals are not just phrases, as we would like to believe, because they recognize indigenous knowledge as valid knowledge, not as an overlooked one. And the case of Quechua is just one example among others. In the case of Peru, for example, we have 47 languages, and each of them have a value. And at the University of Pennsylvania, we have the chance to not just teach the language, but to do conference, gather students, talk about these issues also in the migration context, as my colleague also mentioned, that indigenous people are moving forward, and also we have this heritage in places such as the United States, and students who are indigenous descendants, and who also want in the university academic system have this recognized. Like in the case, and also bring those questions on the table. For example, in the city of New York, the New York University estimated that about 10,000 people who speak Quechua live. And if we don't do the research, if we don't talk about this, we won't recognize the value of indigenous people in all the context. Indigenous people for a while have been portrayed as atemporal, timeless people. Of course, ancient knowledge is important, but what happens with the people who are here in New York, in Paris, in Tokyo, in Cusco as well, of course. But this knowledge can provide, can help the society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.